All right, Peter. Hi, how are you, man?
Hi, Peter. It's always great to be with you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the times we have to speak is usually because there's some bullshit happening somewhere. I need to talk to you about and go, oh God, what are they doing now?
You put it like that. It's like. Unfortunately, my role in this space is because there's some bullshit happening, and
It is.
That's like my whole life. You get it just once in a while. Well, no, you get it all the time.
Well, no, but in an ideal world, you wouldn't have to do this job.
When I was in law school, I think I went to my administrative law professor and I said, because he's got, he wasn't an economist by training, but he's got like deep economic background because of economic cost benefit analysis and things like that. And I said, do you ever despair that lawyers are just here to, we just deal with transaction costs. We don't create any real value. And he was like, that's really depressing. I don't think that at all. I was like, yeah, that might be wrong, but if this mess wasn't here, no one would have to clean it up. And, so. I mean, it's real value, I guess. Reducing transaction costs is real value, but it'd be better if they weren't there, right?
Well, a lot of the stuff that I have to speak to you about, it would be better if they weren't. It'd be better if Elizabeth Warren wasn't there, sat in her seat.
I didn't say that. That's yeah.
I don't mean that as some kind of like overt threat to Elizabeth Warren. I just wish she wasn't doing the job she was doing.
Yes.
With her army, her anti-crypto army.
Fortunately, we have a democracy, so maybe we can vote her out. I don't know. I don't follow Massachusetts politics though. So.
No, I think she seems pretty firmly rooted there. I'm not even here to talk to you about her directly. I actually spoke to Perry Amborin about her this week. I saved you that one. I saved you that one.
I mean, the niche I've carved out for myself at Coin Center is legal analysis, constitutional law. I like to deal with the topics. I try not to deal with the people because I'm not great with people. I don't know.
You're pretty good in those hearings.
Yeah, but that's me reading a script. The words are mine, and I'm ready to read them. Right.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, it's been a while. It's probably been a year or two since you've been on. We always accumulate new listeners, and some of them won't know who Coin Center are. They won't know who you are. And so can you just give people a background? I mean, more importantly, Coin Center. But yeah, let them know the work you do.
Sure. So Coin Center is based here where I am right now in Washington, D.C. We are a nonprofit research and advocacy organization, and we've been working on cryptocurrency policy issues since 2014, which makes us kind of old in the crypto space, which is kind of funny. When we first started in 2014, 2015, it was mostly a congressional office wants somebody serious to come and explain what Bitcoin is because quite often it was someone in their district got ransomwared, or in other cases, it was good news. It was somebody in their district or a family member of the congressperson, like learned about this stuff, maybe made some money off of it, maybe was just curious or liked technology and wanted someone to explain, like, how is this? What is this? How does it work? How is it different than the traditional financial system? So there was like a lot of demand for that kind of education work, and we would come and do a briefing for staff, for the member, or maybe do a big group briefing in Congress and answer all kinds of questions like, is it used for money laundering? Well, yes, but so is the dollar. And look, there's a blockchain and we can do chain analysis and we can find illicit uses and things like that. And then, gradually as we played that role of just being a sane, mature voice to explain the technology in a relatively neutral way, there'd be these inevitable questions like, there's this Bank Secrecy Act. Financial institutions in the US need to know their customer. They need to collect a lot of identifying information and make reports. Are there people in crypto who need to do that? And the answer is complicated. So it involves policy research, which is where my job comes in, looking at the existing law or some new proposed law and saying, how does this apply to crypto? Can we make it apply in a way that's reasonable to achieve the policy goal, whether it's anti-money laundering or investor protection, like our securities laws. But can we also make sure that in the process, people's fundamental constitutional rights to privacy and speech are protected and the value of just innovation and dynamic economies are protected as well? We don't want to stifle this technology. And so, more and more our work started being these long form reports on the Bank Secrecy Act and how the Constitution interacts with that in the US and where are the limits? Where can we not apply those kinds of rules to crypto? Like, we can't start treating miners as banks and telling them they need to know every name and address of every person whose transactions they're putting in a block, because that's nonsense. And it also would be highly violative of people's privacy. And then more recently, and just sort of rounding it up, we've started doing a lot more actual outreach to sort of lobby for our preferred solutions to policy problems that preserve the freedom to innovate and protect constitutional rights. So we'll go to Congress and we'll say, you've got these questions. They're not just questions now. You're proposing something. Here's a way to make it better. Here's a way to do less harm and protect innovation in the process. And increasingly, and maybe this is an unfortunate turn of events, when we lose those battles in Congress or at the agency level where, say, an agency promotes a new rule, we have to take a lawsuit. We have to bring a lawsuit. And so we've got 2 lawsuits right now against the US Treasury, actually, the IRS, for different aspects of the tax code and the sanctions regime, and how they're being, we would say, misapplied to this technology in a way that's highly damaging to people's privacy. So we can talk about those 2 lawsuits. We can talk about our work in Congress. We can talk about the agencies. I'm just happy to talk with you.
Yeah. Those lawsuits must be expensive.
I mean, I don't have much for scale because this is our first time hiring like high-powered constitutional lawyers who argue at the Supreme Court and win. I'll put in a plug for Consovoy, our attorneys. They're awesome. And to me, I'm not going to just like lay out our whole budget on a public podcast, but to me, actually, it's a very reasonable flat fee to get us up to high-level courts because, you know, they know we're a nonprofit. They believe in the mission. I think, you know, a lot of attorneys in this space, especially the Supreme Court bar, are interested not just for their clients, but also because of the principles of privacy and free speech. So it's great. I guess maybe I'm just like right around Christmas being like, you don't need to donate to Coin Center. We're doing all right financially, but we would love donations because there will be more lawsuits to come in the future and more lobbying to do because things are getting a little bit darker.
Yeah, and despite things being dark and getting darker, and the little faith I have in politicians these days, I do actually find that one of the things I find interesting about the US is that there are institutions or people or companies that do sue parts of the government and win.
Yeah,
that's the large bit of faith I have left.
You know, it's funny. I mean, maybe it's because you're English, but the first thing that comes to mind is de Tocqueville, who's French, but, you know, around the time of the Revolution, writing about America, and said that, like, you know, we're going to get ripped apart by our you know, the mob, and the tendency of democracies to just sort of have a tyranny of the majority. And de Tocqueville said, the one thing that gives me hope is the lawyers out there, which is sort of like people would think that's crazy today because they think the lawyers make everything worse. But it's this interesting aspect of our system wherein, you know, a scrappy attorney and client who think they've got the right idea about what our founding fathers said about privacy or speech can actually upend a massive, you know, $100 million, $1 billion agency decision because we've got judges who still care about the rule of law in this country. And we've got this founding document that sort of is a good way to reason about, you know, when you have a right to privacy, when you have a right to not have the government come and take your stuff without a warrant, these important questions. And so, I'm actually very patriotic as an American, in large part because I believe that our Constitution is this really good mechanism for spurring debate about really fundamental questions like human rights. And even in the context of crypto, like that, it's weird that this over 200-year-old document can have such a say potentially in the way we actually deal with this technology today.
And the amount of things that you're doing now, because you were listening to them earlier, you're a lot busier, a lot more things you're involved in. Is that a reflection of Coin Center growing and realizing there's all these other areas that you can help and support, or is it a reflection of the fact that Bitcoin and, you know, I will say crypto because I know you represent the whole industry, but is it the growth and success of that means more people are looking at it? There's more legal challenges, there's more regulatory challenges.
So the main reason we're more busy is because there's more challenges. And, you know, I think in our early days, to some extent, we had the luxury of being mostly focused on education because most of the big policy changes that were proposed were targeted at big businesses building on crypto, like the Coinbases or Krakens of the world, the exchanges, or maybe the companies that are raising a whole bunch of money on a promise of building a future currency or technology, like the ICO boom. And we kind of stayed out of a lot of those battles because, we're not anarchists. We think there's a role for government to regulate businesses in this space, especially if those businesses are in a trusted relationship with their customers. So if you're promising something to somebody, then it's probably right that some sort of disclosure regime applies to you. And that was almost a sort of unpopular thing for an organization like us to sort of be sort of transparent about back during the ICO boom, because a lot of people were like, nah, no rules. There should be no securities laws. They shouldn't exist. And the same goes for custodial crypto exchanges. Like if a bank needs to get a charter in order to hold people's dollars for them, then why wouldn't a cryptocurrency exchange need to get some sort of regulatory form to hold people's Bitcoin? Because otherwise, that trusted relationship can blow up and all kinds of damage can happen. See, Mt. Gox was the thing we used to talk about when we first started, and now see FTX today. And so, we would sort of give reasonable explanations as to like, how can we apply these important, regulatory regimes to trusted entities in this space, and where should the limit be? Like, we're not going to start regulating software developers as if they're banks, because A, the First Amendment, and B, it wouldn't achieve the results you want. It wouldn't actually protect people. More recently, we're busier, I think, because of that same fact. We don't represent the corporations out there. We represent the technology itself, people's right to write software, people's right to run that software and hold their own crypto in their own, quote unquote, self-hosted wallet, to use the regulator's term. And now, finally, in the last 2, 3, 4 years, we've seen people who are hostile to that technology in Congress and in the agencies actually start to propose direct regulation of the technology itself. So now, we'd positioned ourselves to be this representative of the technology itself and of people's rights to use it. And now we're finally directly under attack. And so that makes us busier. Coin Center actually hasn't grown much. We've finally hired another employee, so we're 6 instead of 5. Landon Zinda, he was a staffer for Tom Emmer in the House of Representatives, and then Senator Toomey in the Senate. He's one of the best crypto staffers that we've been lucky to have on the Hill. And unfortunately, he wanted to leave the Hill. We were like, no, you got to help the Hill more. Yeah. They need more people on the inside helping. But he was like, no, I'm ready to do something next. And so we were super lucky to get him. And, now he's still taking meetings there. He's working for us now.
Well, I guess he knows the people to navigate. He's got the relationships.
Yeah. Which I don't envy that role, because yeah.
Are you finding there's like so the general consensus towards this? Obviously, I'm focused on Bitcoin. That's what I care about. I feel like almost with most things in US politics, it's starting to split the crowd now. There's some people who are very pro, very supportive, and then there's some people very anti it.
That's right.
And I feel like we've got this chance we're winning. We're battling through. There's a growth in the technology, growth of adoption, growth in understanding, all different levels. And then there's like this fierce army who just seem to want to hate it.
And they're not even covert about that. Elizabeth Warren, Senator Warren, came out and said, "I'm building a anti-crypto army." And so maybe it's wrong to just go straight to Elizabeth Warren too, because she is obviously the extreme version of this deep skepticism, even seemingly hatred of this technology. So just like the sense of Congress in general, I mean, I think you're right. And I think what you're hinting at is that it's not just, there's people who like it and don't like it, because there's always, to some extent, been that. It's that, and this is very sad for me, because I don't like party politics in the US. It's just it's sick, frankly. But increasingly, we're seeing things become partisan. So, it used to be you could find a Democrat and a Republican, like Mick Mulvaney, who ended up working at the Trump administration. Back when he was in Congress, he co-founded the blockchain caucus with Jared Polis, the Democratic governor of Colorado. So it was like, it used to be bipartisan. You could find 2 people who liked this stuff. And then at the same time back then, you could find 2 people who were like deeply skeptical. I remember Joe Manchin was not overtly hostile, but was like, what is this? Isn't it just crime? And then on the Republican side, you had more national security type oriented people being like, isn't this just going to help terrorists? And you could go in, you could have a conversation, you could educate, and you could move people, because they didn't feel like by moving their position with new information, they'd be betraying some tribal lineup that they're sort of subjected to or forced to obey by virtue of being a Democrat or being a Republican. And I think in large part because of a few things. I think Senator Warren, she's very influential on the left of the Democratic Party. By her sort of like planting a flag and saying we're going to be anti-crypto, we lost ground there. And simultaneously, Republicans who think, well, I'm undecided on this issue. I look around me. What are my compatriots in the House saying? If they see Elizabeth Warren saying, I hate this, they say, well, actually, maybe I like this then. I wasn't sure before, but if she hates it, maybe And then, the other thing that happened, which is very complicated and unfortunate, when Facebook, to go back to like actual, now sort of distant history, given so much has happened in the last few years, when Facebook announced Libra and they branded it, remember they originally branded it a cryptocurrency?
Yep.
And we were like, lots of people like Coin Center, among others, were like, that's not a cryptocurrency. You're talking about like a group of 18 corporations or whatever having a round robin on a blockchain. That's not crypto. Might be good tech, but it's not crypto. They were, I think, unfortunately successful at branding their thing crypto and then utterly destroying their reputation and crypto's reputation in the process, because the rollout was a mess. They didn't get a lot of allies in Congress before they got attacked by people who were like already on the anti-big tech team. And so to some extent, that moment and what happened over the next few years after that, it was sort of like, if you were already, especially a Democrat who was wary of the scams, because you're very concerned about investor protection, as you should be. And there are a lot of scams in this space. Now you've got that concern, plus the fact that if you just take a cursory look at the way companies and people are branding themselves in the space, crypto isn't a big revolution against big corporations and banks. It's just more big corporations. It's just the tech bros, quote unquote, coming for the banking sector. So you've now got this narrative that says this is all just big tech, and I'm still doing my job as a good progressive Democrat, hammering against the corporations that are trying to screw Americans. And so that narrative became pretty pervasive, and it's hard to fight against it. It's right to fight against it. I don't need to tell you or your listeners, like this is the best technology to break up giant monopolists and banks with a better alternative, but it's a hard sell.
Yeah, it should have been an easy sell to Elizabeth Warren. It would have felt an easy sell, a decade ago?
I don't know. And I try not to overpsychoanalyze folks because I can't get inside their head. But I do know to some extent there's this notion that if your reason for being is to protect people from corporations, do you like and embrace a solution to dealing with like corporate greed or lack of transparency or monopoly that takes away your reason for being? Like if your solution to corporate greed is government should come in and nationalize the banking sector, you really don't want the banking sector to be fixed in the other way, not by further centralizing, but by completely decentralizing. Like it competes with your preferred solution, and you may just not believe it, which is fair. Like decentralization is we talk about it all the time. Are we there? I mean, unfortunately, no. Bitcoin mining is still fairly centralized. In many cases, Ethereum is even worse. A lot of the so-called DeFi projects are all just like four guys with a multi-sig. So,
what are the significant threats right now? I do want to talk to you about this bank secrecy stuff, but just before we get into that, where are the significant regulatory threats right now? What are you worried about or focused on?
So, like I said, if we were talking 4 or 5 years ago, we'd be sort of forced to talk about securities law a lot and about how like the SEC's overbroad interpretation of what is a security means they get too many prudential and permission-based regulatory controls over the space. And I always had trouble with that because there were definitely tokens sold in the crypto space that probably were securities and probably would have benefited from more disclosures from the issuers, right? What's changed and what makes things a lot more high stakes now is that regulators and lawmakers are not just coming for the scams anymore. They're not just trying to clean up our space, which I'd frankly welcome. They're now trying to impose fairly aggressive permission-based regulations on the core infrastructure providers themselves. And so maybe just a couple examples. Senators Warren and Marshall, a Republican, have a bill that would classify miners, node operators. It even has terms like MEV searchers and software developers of unhosted or self-hosted wallets, all as Bank Secrecy Act regulated, which means they're not allowed to do the things they do, whether it's publish software or mine new blocks, without knowing the name and address, the identification of all the people putting transactions in that block, or all the people using that self-hosted wallet to hold their own Bitcoin.
Which is impossible. That's not only,
it's impossible, right? Yeah. So it's not only probably unconstitutional, because we have certain rights to privacy in this country, and forcing people to spy on other people just because they use their software or just because their transactions in their block is probably unconstitutional. It's also impossible. Like you said, it would grind these networks to a halt. So that's a big one. And then another example that we can talk about more is the Tornado Cash sanction. So, I know your audience is more Bitcoin oriented, but
they care about this one.
Yeah, and I think that's right, because it also has implications for things like Wasabi Wallet or CoinJoin transactions generally in the Bitcoin space. There are some mixers out there that are custodial, and so it's reasonable to regulate them like you regulate Coinbase, because they're custodial, right? Coinbase, in a certain sense, is a mixer. The money all goes into an omnibus wallet, it comes out. So it's fair to treat them as a regulated entity and to have them do some level of financial surveillance to prevent illicit funds moving through their wallets. Tornado Cash, say what you will about the things that were sort of adjacent to it, like the Torn token and some other stuff that frustrates me. The core contracts that did the privacy function were immutable smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. Well, Bitcoin audience, as immutable as any smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain is. But there was no day-to-day control over any of the funds in that pool, and the privacy that you got out of it was quite good compared to using Ethereum generally. So if an American wants to use that for our own privacy, and they don't end up paying anyone in North Korea by using it, because they don't, and they don't end up paying the developers by using it because they don't, why can't we use that smart contract? And I've sort of failed to set it up adequately if you haven't been following Tornado Cash, but the long and short of it is OFAC, a wing of the US Department of Treasury, came in and said, Americans can't use this smart contract anymore because it's the property of a sanctioned entity, which is nonsense, because a smart contract that no one can edit is not the property of anyone, any more than the Bitcoin protocol writ large is the property of Satoshi. And telling Americans they can't use it for their own private purposes is deeply anti-liberty, and also obviously really bad for the technology. So we're suing. That's one of our two lawsuits, is to say that they can't identify the smart contract itself as something Americans can't interact with.
Right. Okay. In terms of this self-hosted wallet term, what I hate.
I know. I hate it too.
Yeah, but the fact that they're using it, I keep thinking about it. It's like, I have a wallet with my credit cards and my cash. It feels like they're essentially trying to regulate the same thing as that. It's like saying your wallet in your pocket, we're going to regulate that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, the self-hosted wallet term is actually the slightly improved term that we sort of kind of tried to drag them towards, because they used to say unhosted. It's either a hosted wallet, which sounds good. It's like, a Christmas host, or it's unhosted. It's just like hanging out there in the wilderness.
In the wild, partying.
Party. So, yes, that's the correct metaphor. It's just hard to get people to understand that, right? Like a scrap of leather that you hold your dollars or your credit cards in, it would be absurd to say, that scrap of leather is a financial institution, just like JP Morgan or Bank of America. And so that scrap of leather, and whoever makes it and advertises it and puts it out in the world, needs to identify the people who are putting dollars in it. It's absurd. I mean, to give a little bit of sort of fairness, because that metaphor is a strong metaphor. I think it's the right metaphor. The fact of the matter is, like, if you're using a wallet that is on the Android Play Store or the Apple App Store, the developers of that wallet can regularly push updates And at one point, they could push an update that actually, has a bug in it, or is even malicious and steals people's crypto, right?
Yeah.
So there's a level of trust here that's maybe a little bit stronger than just the guy who stitches this together, like a leather wallet, or a safe manufacturer. Although the metaphor's still right. You're just buying maybe a slightly defective safe. That doesn't mean we'd regulate safe manufacturers as banks and say you need a camera in your safe that you sell, so every time your user opens it, they see their face and then report that to the government. And there are ways to get at issues like bugs in software or even malicious software that don't involve having like wall-to-wall surveillance over people's usage of the software. You would say, no, it's subject to the FTC's unfair deceptive acts and practices law, which doesn't mean that the software developer, like if it's Bitcoin Core, needs to come into the FTC and say, do we have permission to publish this? Not at all. There's no permission involved. It just says, oh, if you publish it and it actually stole people's money, then the FTC can sue the developers of that software in order to protect the users of that software. So that's a reasonable regime for protecting users of software, even in an environment where software can often be buggy and even malicious. This notion that we would, however, say that that's not enough. What we need is true, like wall-to-wall surveillance of people's own use of their own software or of someone else's software, is much more akin to like the encryption debates that we had in the 90s, where it was like, we can't have strong encryption out there. All encryption needs to have a little back door so that law enforcement can decrypt any ciphertext whenever they want because of terrorism or because of financial crime or a number of other things. And that's a debate, I guess. But in the encryption context, it's obvious how that's just not going to work out well, because backdoor keys get lost and the wrong people end up with them. Or even if it's just the right people, quote unquote, that have them, if it's the governments become corrupt, governments become tyrannical.
Yeah.
And there's a very important American, but also Anglo-Saxon and maybe just global notion that the citizen should reserve certain rights for themselves and have some ability to defend themselves against an oppressive sovereign. And if you tell people they can't have strong encryption, you're disarming them in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, they took it here. I don't know if you've followed what happened here, but enter encryption is essentially been banned here in the UK.
Really? I haven't been following.
Yeah, it's the online safety bill. I need to follow go and check the details, but I'm pretty sure it's entering encryption's been bad because they want to protect children from pedophiles and they want to stop people, transferring images across networks, which is a noble cause, but
of course,
but is a, for want of a better word, a backdoor way of dealing with a problem they're not going to stop. But it does mean that we've kind of lost end-to-end encryption here. I think Signal said they're moving out of the market. So, yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah.
I mean, but we don't have a constitution.
I was going to say this goes back to... So, I mean, a lot of our American legal traditions come from the UK, and a lot of really important rights and notions of property and tort come from the Anglo-Saxon common law. But when you don't have a written constitution, because you've got this rich unwritten constitution in the UK. When you don't have a written constitution to sort of reason about, things can maybe go off the rails a little bit more easily. Anyway, not to get into a comparative constitutional law discussion, but
we actually, I should correct, because someone will email me and they'll be saying, well, no, we have the Magna Carta, but it's not something anyone I know has read or cares about, and it's not like we have something like, well, we must protect my First Amendment rights or Fourth Amendment rights. Like, we're not like that in the UK. We just take a beating every now and again, accept everything. We just, all right, the king said so. Okay, so listen, you did this monster report on the Bank Secrecy Act. Mm-hmm. So I'm aware of it, but when I first heard you, Danny told me you'd release this report, I was like, is this advanced work ahead of potential lawsuits? You're basically claiming the Bank Secrecy Act is unconstitutional. Is that to help you essentially prepare for all these lawsuits? And
yes.
And could the Bank Secrecy Act be declared unconstitutional, and therefore could it be repealed? I mean, is it that big?
So, a few things. You've hit the nail on the head as far as it being advanced work. In fact, this paper that we published, which is called Broad, Ambiguous, or Delegated Constitutional Infirmities in the Bank Secrecy Act, and it's on our website. We wrote it about 2.5 years ago, actually. And we just published it now.
Wow.
And the reason for that is this paper, it's a different. So, we try and develop multiple lines of attack, or defense, actually, in this case, so that, if we need to bring a lawsuit about the overzealous application of something like the Bank Secrecy Act to miners or to software developers, we have many different ways to defend ourselves. In case one fails, we've got resiliency. And this one is not an argument under the Fourth Amendment or the First Amendment. So, for non-US listeners, it's not an argument about, code is speech, and so you can't censor people from publishing code, the First Amendment. It's not even an argument that, the government should have a warrant before they go search your Bitcoin wallet for private keys or whatever, which would be a sensible argument to make if software developers of wallets were classified under the Bank Secrecy Act and needed to surveil their users. That would be a warrantless search of all of those users through the software developer and manifestly inappropriate. This paper is actually a new species of defense or argument against that encroachment of the Bank Secrecy Act that says, the law itself, the Bank Secrecy Act, as it was written by Congress in the 1970s, enabled the executive branch, the president and the secretary of Treasury, to, without any restriction, choose who in this country is going to be classified as a financial institution, and therefore choose who in this country, amongst anyone, it could just be an ordinary guy with a small business, needs to surveil their customers, like anyone who comes into the shop, say it's a barber shop, you got to collect their name and their address and report about their customers' activity. And you might think, well, that sounds crazy because it's the Bank Secrecy Act. Doesn't it only apply to banks and bank-like institutions? And the answer is no. Congress, I think, probably because of maybe Iranian terrorism or other matters that were going on in the 1970s, said, and at the Swiss bank situation, the tax evasion situation, said, let's just give to the president an unbridled power to decide who should have to do this kind of surveillance. And that's why we're in this situation today where the Secretary of Treasury can just, with this sort of rulemaking rather than an act of Congress, with a sort of wave of a wand, say, now self-hosted wallet software developers are financial institutions and need to surveil their customers. And so in the US, there's this notion, the separation of powers, but of course it comes from England and France and Montesquieu and others, which is this idea that, the elected body, the Commons in the UK, or the Congress in the US, is the only body that should be making law. That power is vested in the legislature. And the executive is only there to enforce the law. They shouldn't be making deeply consequential choices about what the law is. They should just be filling in the details, what's missing, and then going out and enforcing that law. And then the courts play another role of adjudicating, wherever issues arise into how to interpret the law or how to apply the law. And so in our constitutional system in the US, you can actually bring a lawsuit saying that statute, the Bank Secrecy Act, because it was Congress saying, here, President, here, Secretary of Treasury, now you can make the law. Now you can decide who needs to surveil their customers and collect information without a warrant. That is unconstitutional because Congress isn't allowed to abdicate, to give up its otherwise exclusive power to make law. And so this might sound very eggheady and academic, but it's fairly pragmatic to bring this kind of argument up today because in the US we have a Supreme Court, best exemplified probably by Justice Gorsuch, but also a nucleus of justices around him who believe that the administrative state has developed far too much discretion and power and needs to be sort of reined in. And, a lot of people frame that as a small government thing. And they say, oh, they're just trying to blow up the US regulatory system. And that's not true. If you read these justices, they say that's part of it. The other part is this will discipline Congress and force them to be more serious. So the reason Congress can't make any laws now is because they don't have to. Because if Congress doesn't act, the executive branch can just make up the laws on its own. If we take that power away from the executive branch, the importance of Congress actually getting off of its butt and finding a way to agree with each other is magnified. And then we'll finally have the actual elected representatives of the people choosing to make highly consequential decisions, like who needs to surveil who in this economy, rather than it just being like, well, Congress never does anything, so just forget them and let the executive branch sort of make it up as it goes along. And so we're at this point where we've got these conservative justices or more rule of law minded justices who I think are open to this discussion. And the Bank Secrecy Act, which is one of our biggest threats from a regulatory perspective, because its overbroad application just makes this technology non-viable, aside from people who are willing to just go out and break the law, which, there's something to be said for civil disobedience in the long run, but nobody, if we could keep people out of jail, that'd be great. And keep Bitcoin alive and keep people out of jail. So this is a great opportunity, I think, where we could bring another challenge that's actually right in the legal constitutional zeitgeist right now, as far as what are they thinking at the Supreme Court. So this paper makes that argument in advance of us needing to make this argument. Our other lawsuits don't make this argument, but if we needed to bring a new lawsuit in the next few years, this would be a prime one to bring, especially with respect to an overbroad application of the Bank Secrecy Act.
I mean, there's a lot in there. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So firstly, I mean, it's great to hear that some of these justices out there believe there is a far too much overreach from government, because it does seem there's a lot of stuff that, for me as a tourist who travels occasionally to the US, has a lot of friends there, observes the US, is fond of the country, observes the government, and it feels very un-American at times. My friends from America often talk about freedom, and you seem to have a huge federal government who seem to want to invade every aspect of the electorate's freedom at the moment. So to hear that there are justices out there who are observing that is quite interesting. But why, if it was, did you say it was in the 70s the Bank Secrecy Act was established?
That's right.
Yeah. Has it been constitutionally challenged before? Are you like the first people to recognize and go, oh, hold on a second?
It was challenged right after it passed into law. I think the case is 1971. I could be wrong about that. And the first case where it was brought in to the Supreme Court to be challenged is called California Bankers Association versus Schultz. And so you had an association of bankers suing, saying like it's not right for us to be forced to become the deputy of the U.S. government in their surveillance apparatus. Like, we don't want to do that, and we have privacy rights as bankers, which is an interesting argument. And our customers have privacy rights as our customers, and you're forcing us to violate our customers' own rights. And actually, a co-plaintiff to California Bankers Association was the ACLU, so the American Civil Liberties Union sued as well. And I'm going to say we, because I'm obviously on that side of like, there should be warrants for this kind of surveillance. We lost. And we lost for interesting reasons. We lost for a couple reasons. The ACLU's challenge, where they said, we're bank customers. We, the ACLU, have bank accounts at some of the banks that are now subject to this law. And so our privacy and our members, because they're a membership organization, privacy is in jeopardy. And unfortunately, the ACLU's challenges got thrown out because the ACL couldn't prove that they'd made any transactions that were greater than $10,000 in cash, which is at the time the only kind of transaction that triggered a reporting requirement and a sort of surveillance or a search for the Fourth Amendment purposes. And so that claim wasn't even adjudicated until later in another case called Miller, which was about this it's about a guy who's trying to illegally make moonshine in his backyard. And so much less sympathetic plaintiff, or defendant, if you will, in this case, like the ACLU is standing up for your rights. Yeah, good. Oh, this crappy bootlegger who, might be involved in murder for hire and other stuff is standing up for your rights. It's bad facts sometimes make bad law, and that's unfortunate. But and I'll say this really briefly, another important thing about California Bankers Association, that decision, is that the court said, look, there was one justice, Justice Powell, who was the deciding vote, because it was a really close case, interestingly. And Justice Powell said, I'm going to go along with this as constitutional, but only as it's applied today, because the Secretary of Treasury has the power to decide how broad or narrow this law is. And right now, it's quite narrow. They're only requiring transactions reporting for over $10,000. The law only applies to insured banks. There's no such thing as suspicious activity reports. He didn't say that because obviously there was no such thing as it. He didn't know it was going to be a thing. So as the law exists today, it's constitutional. And so that decision, the swing vote, and we almost won. It's interesting there was a swing vote, was based on how it was applied in the 1970s. Since the 1970s, you see inflation
Yeah.
Meaning that those $10,000 thresholds, which used to be the equivalent of like $60,000 transactions, needed to be reported or so. Now it's just 10,000 as we understand it today, which means many more of our day-to-day transactions get swept up in a surveillance regime. We've seen new reporting requirements like suspicious activity reports, which are any suspicious activity as judged by the financial institution over $2,000 needs to be reported. And the thing that I think a lot of people miss too is back in the 1970s, how many transactions did people make with their bank? Like per day, per week, per month? A handful, because everything was done using physical cash back then. So if you went to an adult bookstore and you bought something, I'm doing scare quotes, questionable, no one's going to know. And that's probably good because it's your right to, explore yourself and explore knowledge and things without somebody looking over your shoulder all the time if you're not actually doing anything wrong. Nowadays, if you go to an adult bookstore, you're going to use Venmo, or you're going to use a credit card. And so all of your transactions now are kept by the bank and available to government without a warrant. So the long and short of it is the Bank Secrecy Act was constitutional as applied in the 70s. That's what the Supreme Court found. Hasn't been challenged since. And since then, it's incredibly more violative of our personal privacy than it used to be because of those things. Inflation, more reporting obligations, nobody using physical cash anymore. And so it's really ripe now for a challenge based on this Fourth Amendment notion that, like, if we don't have a right to be free of warrantless searches from our bank, what good is the Fourth Amendment? And I think a lot of justices are sympathetic to that, like this idea that once you hand your information over to a business like Google or Microsoft or JP Morgan, you shouldn't have privacy rights over it anymore. A lot of justices are sympathetic to that. There's a recent case called Carpenter about cellular location data that shows the court's ready to sort of narrow that carve out from the warrant requirement.
If that's the case often listed against the Fourth Amendment, wasn't that raised in Ross Ulbricht's case?
Yes, almost certainly. I don't remember reading it specifically in the briefs for Russell Ulbricht, but a good lawyer would have been absolutely right to bring that up. Yeah. Carpenter was this case where, and it was maybe early 2000s. No, I guess 2012 maybe. So cell phone providers like AT&T and Verizon here in the U.S., they know where all their subscribers are 24/7 with like geographic precision of feet. Like they know I'm standing in my bedroom right now because my phone is triangulated between the three cell towers that are giving it signal. And so the practice in the 90s and the 2000s was if the local police want to just find out where I am at any given time, they don't need to get a warrant from a judge. They can just send a letter or get on the phone with Verizon and be like, hey, where's Peter? Or even worse, they could be like, somebody got hurt on this block in Washington, D.C. Tell us every one of your cell phone subscribers that was in that area within an 8-hour period. And this kind of like mass surveillance power is exactly what the warrant requirement was supposed to fight. It was our constitutional response to the king sending redcoats into houses and rifling through patriots' papers to find people who weren't paying their taxes. It's like, no, there can be a process to find tax evasion, but it should be a process that involves a judge before the soldier just walks into the home and like starts rifling through papers and scaring people. And so, the Supreme Court, it hears this case Carpenter about cell phone location data, and it says, all right, in the past we've said once you hand your private information over to a corporation like Verizon, there's no right to a warrant. Government can just search that information willy-nilly. We can't have that be the way things work anymore, because then there's no privacy, because everybody uses a cell phone, which means everybody's location history will be perfectly preserved and available without a warrant 24/7. And so that was the first time the court was faced with this in the world of the internet, in the digital age. Do we really have no more right to a warrant because we happen to do everything over a computer, which means we happen to give up all this information to third parties? That can't be. So let's narrow these things, And the funny thing about crypto is also a response to that, right? In a large part, like the evolution of the Fourth Amendment jurisprudence of the court is a response to people are doing too much with trusted entities, and that means they don't have a right to privacy anymore. And Bitcoin's response to that is, we should just build better systems that mean we don't have to give this information to trusted entities. They're both great. Like this is why I love my job, because I get to work in the crypto space where we're building tools that fix these privacy problems. And I get to work in the legal space where hopefully we can get the court to push back on these problems. The problem we have now is what I call forced reintermediation. So I think there are people in government who see crypto's solution to this problem. Well, we'll just get rid of the intermediaries and hate it. They would disagree with the Supreme Court. They'd say, no, it's okay that we don't need a warrant to get this information from Verizon. But they also, of course, disagree with this idea that, well, maybe we wouldn't need a Verizon. Maybe we wouldn't need a JP Morgan. Maybe we wouldn't need a corporation in between. We could just have peer-to-peer internet protocols. And their solution to that, to the extent they have a solution, it's not a very realistic one, is reintroduce intermediaries. Force the Bitcoin miner to be just like JP Morgan, even though they don't do anything like what JP Morgan traditionally did. Force the software developer for a wallet to be just like Verizon and to have that kind of level of control and visibility into the users of their software that a typical service provider has. And it's a backward idea, both from a technology. It's like, let's go back to the early 90s internet or even the 80s because we need this information, because the government needs to know more about its citizens. That shows an amazing lack of faith in the citizens. Like, most people are not criminals. And it shows an amazing sort of regressive tendency in, like, I don't care about technology. I don't care about progress. I just want the world to be like it was. Where the government, had a bunch of information about everybody, and there was no way for people to go about their lives without giving up that information.
So can you challenge the whole act, or would you just challenge its application to crypto/Bitcoin?
Yeah. So as Coin Center, our mission is to defend the freedom to innovate using crypto. And as I said, we're not usually asking for special treatment. We're not out there saying we should be regulated less strictly than banks when we're doing bank-like activities, because that creates moral hazard. The custodians of crypto are just as likely to be untrustworthy as the custodians of dollars. And so Coin Center's mission is to say, look, just apply the same rules for our technology as you do the legacy banking sector. And that would mean the Coinbases of the world should be subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, just like JP Morgan is. But it would also mean we can't create a situation, to use the metaphor that you brought up, where a wallet manufacturer in the physical world is suddenly obligated to put like a surveillance device in every wallet they sell or safe that they sell. And we don't want that in our world, where a software manufacturer has to build a backdoor into all their software tools. The larger conversation, though, is like, maybe the BSA is a raw deal, even with respect to custodial entities and trusted entities, because it's not there to protect customers. It's just there to surveil them. And are there better ways to get at that information, or to get at that problem of illicit financial flows and terrorism? And I think there's a growing conversation that says, actually, yeah, there are probably better ways to do anti-terrorism and to do counter money laundering than just hoovering up a bunch of data about innocent people. Because the collateral consequences of hoovering up all that data about innocent people is deplatforming. Banks call it de-risking, which is a euphemism. No, you're just saying, no, I won't bank you anymore, or I'm going to freeze your account because you wrote Cuban sandwich in the memo field of your payment, or something like that, and they're a sanctioned country. And so, and also, aside from the liberty interest being really profound, like, say what you will about the Canadian truckers who were protesting the vaccine mandate in Canada, was it right for the government to, without any legal process, just freeze all their bank accounts because they were protesting with their trucks? Probably not.
No.
The other problem here, even if you're not concerned about the liberty interest of these financial surveillance laws, is just the compliance costs and the degree of inefficiency. So if every financial transaction needs to be vetted 5 times over before it can be allowed to enter the canonical ledger of the global financial system, the global financial system will stop running. It just will break.
Yep.
And identity is a terrible tool because it's extremely cheap to forge an identity, to create a fake passport or a fake driver's license or a fake attestation of that to your financial institution. And the costs of trying to get around that cheap fraud are incredibly high. And so, like, what are we going to do in a world where machine learning means even a video in-person identification session, which is now considered the gold standard? It's like $5 per ID or something like that from these cybersecurity providers, where even this video conversation could be faked. Like, if you're my bank and I'm your customer and you're trying to make sure I'm me, you're like, Peter, look to the right, look to the left. Yep. But I could be AI. I could be a large language model right now, and you wouldn't necessarily know. So we're going to spend a fortune trying to keep proving that people are who they are, and every transaction has a name attached to it that's a real name. It's not going to work. and we're just going to waste a ton of money and violate everyone's privacy in the process. And people who are sophisticated, who can set up a shell corporation with like 5 levels of fake names and fake organizations on top, are still going to get away with it. It's just a perverse outcome where the worst among us have privacy because they're sneaky, and those of us who are just trying to use regular systems as regular people inevitably get subjected to this mass warrantless surveillance regime, and everything we do ends up in a database somewhere.
Ugh. So what is the next steps on this?
Yeah. So as I said, it's, this report about the non-delegation doctrine and the Bank Secrecy Act is sort of prep for a future lawsuit. If, say, Elizabeth Warren's legislation that classifies Bitcoin miners as Bank Secrecy Act regulated was to pass, we would challenge it on Fourth Amendment grounds.
Okay.
If it was not to pass, and right now we're optimistic that that's not going to become law anytime soon, although it can always change. As I said, the regulators in Treasury, some of whom are sympathetic to the Senator Warren's views here, could just do this by rulemaking. Without Congress passing a law, they could treat miners or software developers as BSA regulated, which is insane.
Right.
If that happened, we would bring a lawsuit where we say, this is unconstitutional. Like, in our constitutional system, Congress makes these highly consequential decisions. The executive branch can't just do it with delegated power from Congress. And we'd say, and therefore, as applied here, the Bank Secrecy Act is unconstitutional because it gives too much power to the president to decide who it does and does not apply to. And that wouldn't mean that the whole BSA just suddenly blows up, like in some video game. It would mean that that particular agency action would be deemed unconstitutional. And the BSA, going forward, if you want to include new entities within the surveillance ambit, you need Congress to make that decision. You can't just have the agency do it through rulemaking. So it would be a sort of minimum viable lawsuit to stop this kind of really bad outcome for crypto. But it would also open a larger discussion about the BSA in general.
So do I need to read the 62-page report?
No.
I can imagine it's quite dense. No, I can take a look.
I mean, so it's dense, but if you find constitutional history and the evolution of these doctrines interesting, it might be an engaging read. I like to think I'm a decent writer. I actually got a really nice compliment from Niall Ferguson. A brilliant Scottish economic historian. He read our Fourth Amendment, a 2009 report, and said it's one of the best reports he's read this year, which is actually like he's like an academic hero of mine. So that was pretty great. So I'm tooting my own horn, but there are folks who think that it's interesting reading, and he's not a lawyer, so hopefully it's interesting reading.
All right, I would definitely take a look. Before we finish off, there are a couple more things to go through. You did mention you got 2 lawsuits at the moment. It'd be good to touch on those to know what you're doing, so people are aware.
Yeah. So the Tornado Cash lawsuit I already described in general.
Yeah.
And that's really important because if OFAC can identify the Tornado Cash smart contract as sanctioned property of some entity that doesn't even control it, then they could also identify, in theory, a Bitcoin wallet software stack as sanctioned property, even if it's open source software. And then Americans would be violating the law if they continue using that Bitcoin software. And the same is true of any open source software. It would give Treasury this power to just veto technologies because they're being used by our national security enemies, which is bad policy from a national security standpoint, but also just terrible for liberty and for technological progress. So hopefully we'll win that. We're in the 11th Circuit appealing. We lost to the district court, but we think we lost in a way that we can actually convince the appeals court that the district court was very wrong and a dangerous outcome if they let it stand. So we're optimistic. And then we've got another lawsuit in the tax context. And so this goes back to probably the last time we talked deeply about Congress, Peter, was 2 years ago when Congress was passing the Infrastructure Act, which was like, we're going to raise a bunch more money to build bridges in this country, which is good. But we're going to claim that we're raising it by closing loopholes in crypto tax reporting. Yeah. And one of the loopholes we see is that whenever people receive crypto over $10,000 as ordinary people, not as financial institutions, they should collect the name and social security number and address of the person who's paying them and report it to the IRS. So
I remember this because somebody was saying to me, is like, and they were explaining the inflation point. It's like, if I sell my car to somebody and it's $11,000, I now have to do a report on this, which is ludicrous. Maybe it was you who explained that.
Yeah, if the person's paying in cash, that's been the law for a long time in the US. It's kind of crazy. I think it's just wrong and unconstitutional. That now applies to crypto starting this January, actually. It was very timely because Congress wrote the law 2 years ago and said it goes into effect this next tax year. We still haven't gotten guidance from the IRS as to how the hell they're going to implement this, because it's a lot of forms they're going to be getting if people are actually obeying the law. And it's unclear which form people are even supposed to fill out and who they're supposed to send it to with all this private information about this person paying them. And so we've got a lawsuit saying that reporting requirement for ordinary people receiving $10,000 or more in crypto is also unconstitutional, mostly on the Fourth Amendment warrantless search grounds that we've discussed throughout this podcast. And that lawsuit, unfortunately, we got our lawsuit dismissed for lack of ripeness, because the judge in the district court in Kentucky said, the law hasn't gone into effect yet, so you can't sue yet. And that's actually, I think she was wrong, because you are allowed to preemptorily challenge laws that are imminent, that will have imminent consequences for the defendants. And so we're now appealing that dismissal. And as we're appealing, the law is going to go into effect. So no matter what, eventually a court's going to hear the merits of our argument, but as of yet haven't. And so those are our two current pending lawsuits. And if there was to be some sort of new law like Senator Warren's surveillance proposal for Bitcoin miners and software developers, or if Treasury was to do it through rulemaking, we'd have a third or maybe a fourth lawsuit as well. So it's like holiday season at Coin Center. We're Santa Claus giving out lawsuits.
Peter, you are busy.
Yeah,
I feel like he's gonna get busier. Wow. Okay. Well, listen, I always think when we cover these topics, it's really good to update people and let people know. I find it fascinating. I always end up leaving thinking we need a constitution in the UK, and when I say that, I mean a constitution people actually care about. Although what I do find is interesting about the US is it feels like everyone knows and understands what the First and Second Amendment are, and people will campaign on the streets and fight for them. I feel like there's a lot of people who don't really understand beyond the First and Second Amendment, whereas actually people like you do. But you don't see people protesting on the street saying we must protect our Fourth Amendment rights.
Yeah, and the non-delegation one, this idea that Congress should make law and not the president, is a huge one. And the people who get that in the U.S. tend to be the sort of libertarian or libertarian adjacent people who want small government. But it really should be a liberal issue as well.
Yeah.
In fact, in the original case that said that the Bank Secrecy Act was constitutional, California Bankers versus Schultz, Justice Brennan, famously liberal justice, massive hero for civil liberties and ending segregation and things like this. And his opinions are just stunning for like a defense of liberty, but in a very traditionally liberal way, not a libertarian or right way. Brennan wrote a dissent in that case. He was on the side saying the BSA was unconstitutional. And he said the problem with the BSA actually isn't necessarily the Fourth Amendment. It might be. The problem is it's this naked delegation of lawmaking authority to the unelected people within Treasury. And so this non-delegation argument, I was actually identified by Justice Brennan, a champion of the left back in the 70s. The non-delegation argument should be very popular on the left, because you might like it when there's an Obama or a Biden in wielding that incredible unconstrained power, but we have to face facts. You're not always going to have an Obama or a Biden there. You're going to have a Trump there. You're going to have a DeSantis or Nikki Haley. Do you really think you want them to have unconstrained power? Shouldn't we just go back to a world where bipartisan legislation in Congress is what is consequential and not just the whims of every next administration? It should just be, shouldn't be a partisan issue.
Peter, fascinating. And I really appreciate you taking the time to explain it to me. And I believe over time you're actually making it more and more understandable for someone like me to understand it, because these constitutional things are complicated. I appreciate everything you've done there, and I do think people should help and support Coin Center and what you're doing. And even though you don't want to always ask for money, you should tell people where to find out more about what you're doing.
Oh, thanks, Peter. So everything we publish is public on coincenter.org. So you can find all our resources there. You can sign up for our newsletter to stay updated. Occasionally, we'll even have sort of calls to action if there's something that is truly worth calling a congressperson about in your district or things like that if you live in the U.S. And of course, you could donate. We're a nonprofit. So we rely on donations to keep doing the work we're doing. And I think we use them efficiently and judiciously. Like I said, we've just hired our 6th employee after many years. And despite being small, we do a pretty good body of work. So
yeah, that's incredible, the amount of work you do for that size team. Okay, look, appreciate that. Yeah, please do go and check out Coin Center, support them. You accept Bitcoin, don't you?
Oh, yeah. In fact, on our donation page, it's kind of fun. We changed it not long before the Tornado Cash lawsuit. You can either choose to donate anonymously, in which case you just get a Bitcoin or an Ethereum address, or you can click a different button that says dox myself, but get a free gift. Because then we give out these little Satoshi pocket white papers.
Okay.
It was, we were inspired by the Cato Institute in the US gives out little pocket constitutions to people who donate. And so we were like, we should give out the white papers. You need a t-shirt too.
See how easily someone will bend the knee and dox himself. Okay, listen, we'll throw it all in the show notes. We'll share it all out and make sure people check it out. But again, appreciate everything you do for us. Yeah, I think some people say, oh, just ignore the government, ignore the regulator. I'm like, no, you've got to go and fight these people. And it feels like they're fighting us now. So I appreciate the important work you do and everyone in your team. So thank you.
Oh, and thank you for having me. It's always fun. And to your more hardcore Bitcoin listeners who are like, screw the government, we're gonna survive no matter what. I think that's plausible. I think Bitcoin's really well designed and could survive a lot of attacks from giant nation state actors. But I'd also like to live in a world where fewer people go to jail in that process, if we can. So
that's a fair defense. All right, Peter, keep doing your thing. Hopefully, we will meet at some point because we actually are trying to get out to DC again. There's a lot. It feels like there's a big wave of people in DC now. So we're going to try and get out. I can't remember where it is. There's some point this year we're going to try and get out. So if we are, we'll let you know, and maybe we'll give Matt Stoller a call and see if we can ding round 2 with him.
I'll be a little more polite this time. Yeah,
you were fine. How's Niraj, by the way? Is Niraj good?
Oh, Raj is awesome. Raj got married. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't on a big platform be like, yeah.
I think I knew that. Didn't you put it on Twitter?
Yeah, he probably did.
Yeah, I think he did.
Because sharing his personal life and having people make fun of him is basically his brand. So.
Well, he still wrote my favorite tweet of all time with the umbrella that got stuck and locked the door.
Yeah. And now WeWork is almost completely bankrupt. So, it only took 2 years, but
2 years and one umbrella. All right, Peter, listen, good luck. Anything you need, just reach out. You know where we are.
Thanks so much. Happy holidays, Peter.
Thank you.